Some things to note about our third film, The 39 Steps, and some things to watch for. This is the first film where Hitchcock really used what came to be called the MacGuffin, a term that he himself coined. And you'll read about that more in a later reading, but essentially, a MacGuffin is a plot device, often some kind of literal object, though not necessarily, but something that's used to get the action and the characters moving. But the device itself doesn't actually matter that much in terms of what the film is about. So, in the same way that the lodger wasn't actually all that interested in the murder mystery, the whodunit of it, and we never find out who the Avenger is, but that doesn't really matter. And the story is more about the reactions of the people to the Avenger, and the story is more about complex themes than it is about finding out who the Avenger is, which of course we never do find out. So in this film, keep an eye out for something that seems like a plot device, something that gets the story and the characters moving, and in some sense is their motivation for doing what they do, but that ultimately the story seems to be about something else besides that plot device. Another thing to think about, critics often say that this is the film where Hitchcock really hits his stride using the wrong man formula. So we'll have an innocent man accused of a crime, and Hitchcock uses that storyline to the full extent. And he really does so with both kind of Hitchcockian wry humor as well as this sort of man on the run thrills. And this will definitely be the funniest, or at least the most humorous film that we've watched yet, as well as the kind of most fast paced. And in terms of the humor, that's something to note about Hitchcock, that he almost always does imbue his film with a sense of humor, often a very dry or black sense of humor. Though we haven't quite seen too much of that yet, continue to be watching out for that both in this film and in later films. This film is actually very similar in tone and similar in terms of main character and similar in plot to a film that we're going to be watching later on called North by Northwest. And in some ways, that North by Northwest is a sort of a remake of the 39 Steps, but it uses a totally different setting. But in North by Northwest, the wrong man is played really wonderfully by the star Cary Grant. And I think when we get to that movie, you will definitely see the parallels between this one, The 39 Steps, and North by Northwest. Now, the protagonist of The 39 Steps, he's played by Robert Donat. He sets this really light, witty, kind of flippant tone, and we will see Hitchcock return to that later on, again, especially with characters like Cary Grant in North by Northwest. Also, pay attention to the opening shots of this film. It's an opening that Hitchcock will return to later in something like his film Strangers on a Train, where in both films we are following the movements of the character or characters doing something, but we don't see the characters straight on at first. We'll just see their actions, we'll see their feet, their hands, we'll see what they see, but the face is withheld from us for a bit. And you might consider what the effect of that is and the reason for that is. Another point of interest, this film doesn't really have an overt political content, but as a 1939 film made right before the beginning of World War II, it does capture the sort of zeitgeist of the time. It's a kind of a pre World War II world full of some political intrigue and paranoia. And Hitchcock did often like to include a political setting in his films, but the politics is almost always a way to develop the characters and the tone rather than to be fully themselves political. Another thing you'll maybe notice, there are a few plot holes, or maybe more like we should call them unlikely elements. Kind of these are plot points I don't want to give away, but do consider the way in which Hitchcock really effectively holds our attention, I think, so well that we either don't really notice these sort of unlikely elements or we don't really care about them until maybe you think back later on the film. Hitchcock was actually pretty impatient with those film critics who would only bang on about the plot holes or the unlikely elements in a film while missing the more interesting aspects of character, theme, drama, and emotion. And it's not that his films, and it's not that this film is unrealistic, but he always privileges drama over the strictly mundane, and he privileges drama over realism and banality. One thing we haven't talked about too much yet, but it's really important to the study of Hitchcock's films, is his use of point of view shots or POV shots, where we're seeing something from the perspective of a character, and we're therefore literally immersed in the viewpoint of the character. We're seeing through their eyes. It's quite an immersive technique, putting us right in the middle of the film, as it were, seeing what a character sees as they themselves would see it. And in later films like Rear Window, Hitchcock will fully develop himself to those point of view shots, making us complicit with the characters in their voyeuristic activities. So you might think about where you see any POV shots in this film and how they impact us as viewers in a way that another kind of shot wouldn't do. In this film, too, continue to look out for those recurring Hitchcock elements. Look for the suave villain or the charming villain motif. Also, look for how Hitchcock plays with this theme of appearances versus reality, making us think about that disparity between what we see or what we perceive and what is real. And then continue to think too about Hitchcock, how Hitchcock uses the police figure in this story. This film is positively swarming with policemen, and we might ask how, and we might ask why and how they are being portrayed, and maybe comparing them, for example, to the portrayals of the policemen in The Lodger and also in Blackmail. Also, look for the blonde woman motif. You will see that here. The motif of handcuffs and how handcuffs are used and what they might mean. Also, think about the use of music. Like Blackmail, we'll see Hitchcock use music within the film itself. So, diegetic music that the characters can hear to advance the plot or a theme. And actually, that diegetic music is especially important to the plot itself in this film. Also, this is the first film where we'll see that Hitchcock uses an outdoor or natural landscape in a significant way. It's actually quite beautiful. We have seen Hitchcock use shadows and streets and interior spaces really effectively. So think about how he seems to be now using exterior space for mood and for theme. And he will come back to that in a really fantastic way in North by Northwest as well. Last, this film, at this point in film history, has really fully mastered itself in terms of the use of sound technology. So we're pretty far along in sound technology here. So consider how Hitchcock does use sound and play with sound, but also continue to think, of course, how Hitchcock uses visuals, no dialogue, in a sort of silent movie mode to often tell the story or create a mood or suggest ideas and themes, again, strictly using those visuals.